Hello, I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey. Weeks before January negotiations that could redefine the war in Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelenskyy is tearing down and rebuilding the core of his government, moving his spy chief into the presidential office, reshaping the defense ministry and openly preparing for the possibility that Russia walks away from the table. This looks like insurance, and it tells us a lot about how Kyiv sees the coming month and how little time anyone thinks there really is. Peace talks are supposed to be about de-escalation, about slowing things down, about buying time. What Volodymyr Zelenskyy is doing right now is the opposite, and before January negotiations that could define the war's next phase, Ukraine's president is rebooting the state, in advance under assumption that Moscow might torpedo the process and that Ukraine cannot afford to be caught politically unprepared. So without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
A large-scale corruption scandal in Ukraine's energy sector that broke in November of last year has caused a major shake-up in the nation's political scene. Multiple high-ranking officials with direct links to President Volodymyr Zelenskyy were alleged to have received illicit kickbacks from lucrative contracts with the state nuclear energy provider Energoatom. The investigation into the multi-million-dollar fraud by Ukraine's anti-corruption bureau led to the resignation of President Zelenskyy's former chief of staff Andriy Yermak, as well as the Minister of Energy Svetlana Grinchuk. President Zelenskyy was left with key posts to fill amid pressure from Washington to reach a negotiated settlement on Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine. Now, Zelenskyy has seemingly found a solution in the head of Ukraine's military intelligence, Kyrylo Budanov, as well as the current Minister of Defense, Denis Shmyhal. Zelenskyy announced on January 2nd that he picked Budanov to become his new chief of staff and Shmyhal to become the nation's new energy minister. While Budanov formally accepted the appointment, Shmyhal still needs a majority vote in favor from the Ukrainian parliament to take his post. A lieutenant general and career intelligence officer who has been at the helm of Ukraine's military intelligence since August 2020, Budanov is a highly popular figure in Ukrainian politics. Since 2014, he has played a central role in high-profile operations against Russian forces. Zelenskyy's second key appointment also brings career experience. Previously Ukraine's longest-serving prime minister from 2020 to 2025 and head of the defense ministry since July of last year, Shmyhal was put forward as Ukraine's new energy minister. President Zelenskyy has proposed that Shmyhal be replaced as defense minister by Mykhailo Fedorov, the current deputy prime minister and digital transformation minister.
And now let's zone in on the East-splaining portion of our show. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has nominated Digital Transformation Minister Mykhailo Fedorov to lead the country's defense ministry. Here is a closer look at the figure now at the center of that decision.
Mykhailo Fedorov's nomination also requires approval by the Verkhovna Rada, Ukraine's parliament. If confirmed, the 34-year-old would head Ukraine's Ministry of Defense. Fedorov is one of the most enduring figures from Zelenskyy's inner circle, having joined his team during the 2019 presidential campaign as its chief digital strategist. He later became Ukraine's youngest ever minister, leading the newly created Digital Transformation Ministry and advancing the president's vision of a state within a smartphone. Under his leadership, the DIA platform brought dozens of public services online, while his ministry expanded into defense-related innovation, including drone production and military technology. Zelenskyy cited Fedorov's defense sector digitalization as key reason for the nomination. Fedorov also helped launch Brave One, linking government, the military and private developers to accelerate battlefield innovation. Despite reports of internal power struggles within the president's office, Fedorov remains a popular figure in Ukraine's political landscape. He has also played a crucial behind-the-scenes role as Ukraine's main interlocutor with tech leaders such as Elon Musk, whose Starlink systems have been vital to Ukraine's war effort.
And now we're zooming in on Kyiv to take a look at the issue in greater detail. Speaking last Saturday after meeting national security advisors from 18 partner countries, Volodymyr Zelenskyy laid out a simple logic. Peace is his first choice, diplomacy is the least painful path. But if Russia refuses to stop the war, Ukraine will need fresh forces, not just at the front, but in the government itself. Hence the reshuffle, and it was not a cosmetic one. Kyrylo Budanov, Ukraine's military intelligence chief, moves into the presidential office to lead the negotiations. Mykhailo Fedorov, the architect of Ukraine's digital state and drone ecosystem, is tapped to take over the defense ministry. One man to negotiate with Russia, one to prepare for a technological war if those negotiations fail. Now, these are parallel tracks, and the timing matters. January is not a vague diplomatic window, as by the end of the month, a US-level meeting is expected. When there is so little time to prepare, Volodymyr Zelenskyy is not throwing away his shot. The issue is on the table, a 3-document package already shared with all 18 advisors. Security guarantees, including the Coalition of the Willing and EU membership, a US-linked recovery and prosperity plan, and a step-by-step sequencing roadmap for ending the war. 90% of it is agreed. We're down from 28 points to 20 now. The remaining disagreement is the core of this war, namely territory. In other words, Ukraine is closer to a diplomatic endpoint than at any time since 2022, and also closer to a diplomatic cliff. That explains Budanov. At 39, he has turned military intelligence into one of Ukraine's sharpest tools. He has survived more than 10 assassination attempts. Crucially, he has already negotiated quietly in Abu Dhabi in late November, sitting across from US and Russian representatives. He is being installed because he understands leverage, escalation, and red lines, and because he knows exactly what Ukraine can credibly threaten if talks actually collapse. He replaces Andriy Yermak, whose long tenure at the presidential office ended amid an anti-corruption investigation tied to Energoatom. Zelenskyy said it explicitly. His entire negotiating team is now in one building, centralized, ready. If Budanov is about bargaining power, then, like the new defense minister Mykhailo Fedorov, is about survivability. At 34, he built Ukraine's digital state almost from nothing. Digital passports, wartime services that never shut down. But his real impact since 2022 has been in the military. The Army of Drones program, a 100-fold expansion of domestic drone production, now approaching 200,000 units a month. Zelensky's explanation was blunt. If the war continues, Ukraine's army must become as technologically adept as possible, as fast as possible. And speed is Fedorov's entire career, you see. This is not replacing generals with app developers. It's about accepting a reality Russia already understands. Mass mobilization favors Moscow. Technology, adaptation, and systems integration favor Kyiv. The reboot doesn't stop there. Zelenskyy described a phased reset: the cabinet, law enforcement, security services, the defense ministry, and eventually the armed forces. Commander-in-Chief Alexander Syrsky stays. For now, military leadership changes come only once civilian institutions are reset and working. That sequencing matters, you see. Ukraine is trying to avoid the classic wartime failure, changing everything at once and breaking what still functions. Volodymyr Zelenskyy is not betting on peace. He is preparing for its failure. He is telling partners that Ukraine will negotiate seriously, but will not freeze itself politically while Russia decides whether to play along. This is what wartime governance looks like, when you assume the worst and plan accordingly. Diplomacy first, but never without a plan B. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Bogdan Nahailo, editor-in-chief at the Kyiv Post. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Pleasure to be with you again.
So it is quite a bit of a government reshuffle taking place in Kyiv right now. Can you tell us, why is it taking place at this particular point in time? And what are the most important changes, in your opinion?
This is the most dramatic and far-reaching change, I think, during Zelensky's presidency. I think there are at least two factors. The main factor being a corruption scandal within the administration linked to Yermak, the former head of the president's office, which resulted in his removal. That was something akin to an earthquake in Ukrainian politics, because Yermak had been seen as very much a kind of co-president, a grey cardinal, but very evident and very self-promoting everywhere, including in foreign policy. And the second factor is the need to beef up, I think, the Ukrainian diplomatic efforts and presence, PR abilities abroad, particularly in Washington, and then in Brussels, in the EU too. So what we've seen is partly a response to mainly the response triggered by the latest corruption scandal, which has been by far the largest in recent years. That has led to various changes at the top, but it's also led to people being brought into the center of politics, which are regarded as perhaps potentially threats because of their popularity, like Budanov, the military spy chief, who did not seem to get on very well with Yermak before.
Nobody did, actually. It seemed like everyone had a problem with Mr. Yermak. Let's actually stop at this point for a second. Do you think that Andriy Yermak was a bit of a problem there, because he has managed to create this sort of unique position for himself, whereby he was able to influence major appointments everywhere? If he didn't agree with someone, he was trying to push these people out. I mean, allegedly, Kyrylo Budanov was almost fired at one point because Mr. Yermak tried to remove him, or to have him removed at least. Would you say that this perhaps will represent the sort of like a reset in Ukrainian politics, a moment when the Ukrainian government and the administration will be able to perform this purgation, this cleansing of the ranks, and regain control over the direction that it is taking?
Certainly, I think this is a major reset. It changes the face of politics at the top in Ukraine. Yermak's removal is the key factor. We're still waiting to see what his, let's call him his sidekick, Umerov, who is still there and still representing Ukraine in peace talks. What will happen to him? The signs are that the foreign policy aspect in the presidential office will be taken over by Ukraine's former representative at the UN, Kyslytsya, who is a well-respected, seasoned diplomat and would be the right person to run these sort of talks. Budanov perhaps to run the office and also to make sure that corruption doesn't get out of hand. But look, there have been other very important, shall we say, promotions or appointments. Fedorov, the minister that was responsible for the overseeing the IT revolution in Ukraine and communications revolution, he's been brought in as Minister of Defense, presumably to oversee procurement and to make sure that on the one hand the expansion in the area of drones and Ukraine's capacity to strike out with new technological sort of advances and inventions continues, but on the other hand, as a respected figure, to make sure that corruption within the military doesn't get out of hand. So that's very important.
He's an intriguing character, actually, right? I mean, he's only 34 years old, if I remember correctly, one of the original allies to President Zelenskyy, so he was there right from the start. You've mentioned the IT revolution. So there actually is an app in Ukraine that allows you to do, business related to your official stuff, like, being able to get in touch with the government agencies using a mobile phone. Apparently this is quite successful, and there are even many countries around the globe that want to copy these solutions. But also, if I remember correctly, he also took charge of one of the most important projects that allowed the Ukrainian army to create the sort of new environment for procurement. So setting aside bureaucracy and instead being able to make it essentially into a very modern, very streamlined 21st century system. Would you say that he will be able to make sure that the entire Ukrainian military now goes through this digital revolution and becomes even more proactive in order to face the challenges of today?
Well, he'll certainly try to do that. Don't forget, he's still got the staff that has been there remains, unless heads roll and changes are made. And he will do his best, but he still has to deal with the human personnel that exists there. So it's not going to be sort of change overnight. Not to say that the Ministry of Defense has done a bad job, but Fedorov, I've interviewed him before for Kyiv Post. He was 28 when he was appointed minister. He was the youngest minister in the Zelenskyy setup. And he stayed there all along and has remained close to the president. So that's good. I would have thought that, for example, the former prime minister, Shmyhal, would have been made the head of the office. He's a neutral figure, a technocrat who's delivered, who hasn't displayed, sort of huge personal ambition. He's got a post. He's, if I'm not mistaken, deputy prime minister, now responsible also for technological stuff. He would have been, for me, the logical candidate, but moving Budanov to take over the office is either a concession to the Western pressure, or also perhaps a means of keeping Budanov under control, because Budanov is very popular. I mean, remember that former military figures like Zaluzhny, the commander-in-chief, were removed because they seemed to be getting too popular and were political threats in the long run, in the sense of when elections take place, and were removed. And so, for example, was the Ukrainian ambassador in London, who also was a popular figure. So maybe moving Budanov to the center keeps him in check and close to the president. But on the other hand, Budanov right at the center of things means that Zelenskyy can't get it all his own way anymore. And the big question is, will Budanov be left to administer domestic issues and keep an eye on the intelligence and security agencies, whilst Kyiv, whom I mentioned, deals with foreign policy? But there are still problems here, because effectively in the last few years, the foreign ministry has been moved aside, and Yermak took over the de facto role of foreign minister. So maybe bringing Kyiv, a seasoned diplomat, back into the forefront of things is a good sign. Who else should we mention? The other big factor that's still very important today is who is going to be in charge of the security service, the SBU. And what we know is that the present head, or he may have even gone today already, Malyuk, he's been grumbling. He didn't want to go voluntarily. And it seems that some generals even publicly demanded that he remain. What is behind this is also unclear, because there's shades of a minor mutiny on board, and Zelenskyy will have to play his cards very carefully and bring in somebody firm but loyal to run the security service, the SBU. So, it's still not over yet. Good signs are that young people, capable people like Fedorov, are being appointed, and, for example, the former Finance Minister of Canada, Chrystia Freeland, has been made an advisor on economic reform, modernization as of today in Kyiv, which is also a good sign, I think.
Bogdan Mykhailo was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for helping us decode this government reshuffle puzzle, which right now should appear at least a bit more clear than it did before. So thank you once again.
My pleasure.
And now we move on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you really don't want to miss. Russia's economy is heading toward recession regardless of how the war in Ukraine ends, according to assessments cited by Ukraine's intelligence services, which point to deep structural weaknesses that monetary policy can no longer fix.
Even a hypothetical end to the war would not rescue Russia's economy, according to the Foreign Intelligence Service of Ukraine, citing internal Russian analytical assessments. Economists reportedly see a downturn as inevitable, warning that the recession is likely to begin by July 2026. While tight monetary policy and record high interest rates were initially blamed, analysts now point to deeper structural problems, including falling business confidence, slowing economic activity, and weak domestic demand. Indicators tracking recession risk have sharply deteriorated, signaling the possibility of a prolonged slump. Cuts to military orders, declining household incomes and mounting fiscal pressures are expected to further constrain growth, leaving few paths to recovery even after the war is over.
Finnish authorities are investigating suspected sabotage of a key undersea communications cable in the Baltic Sea, an incident widely seen as part of escalating hybrid threats targeting Western infrastructure.
Finnish police say the anchor of a foreign cargo vessel dragged along the seabed for tens of kilometers before damaging an undersea cable linking Helsinki and Tallinn. The ship was detained on December 31st while traveling from St. Petersburg to Israel, and authorities are investigating suspected aggravated criminal damage and interference with telecommunications. A Helsinki district court ordered the detention of one Azerbaijani national, while several crew members were placed under travel bans. The cable, owned by a Finnish telecom operator, lies in Estonia's exclusive economic zone. The incident adds to growing concerns over repeated damage to Baltic Sea infrastructure since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, often described by officials as part of a broader hybrid war.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.